My name is Kiyoteru Tsutsui. I direct the Japan program here. I'm also the Deputy Director of APARC. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I just came back from teaching from across the campus. That's why I'm a little out of breath. Even though I was on an e-scooter, it still consumes some energy. I'm delighted to welcome this excellent panel of experts to talk about the future of Asian studies. We have first Professor Don Emmerson, who has been running Stanford APARC's Southeast Asia program for decades. He's also affiliated with the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law and the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies. He's also a senior fellow emeritus at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's an expert on Southeast Asia, covers a lot of ground in that region. He has written a dozen books and monographs and over 300 shorter pieces. His most recent book is The Deer and the Dragon, Southeast Asia in the 21st Century. Next to Don is Thomas Gold, who is a legendary professor of sociology, Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley in the Sociology Department. He was executive director of the Inter-University Program for Chinese Language Studies from 2000 to 2016. And he was in the first group of American exchange students to study in China in 1979. His research examines issues of youth, civil society, popular culture, and private business in China, as well as economic, social, cultural, and political change in Taiwan. So he has a lot of expertise on China studies. And then next to Professor Gold is Jisoo Kim, who is Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures at George Washington University. I looked her up on the web yesterday. I got Jisoo from Blackpink, if you know who that is. There's also another actor named Jisoo Kim. But this is the most important Jisoo Kim. She's the founding director of the George Washington Institute for Korean Studies and the founding co-director of the East Asian National Resource Center. And she also serves as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Korean Studies. And she specializes in gender, sexuality, law, emotions, and affect in Korean history. She is the author of The Emotions of Justice, Gender, Status, and Legal Performance in Chosun, Korea, which was awarded the 2017 James Palais Prize of the of the Association for Asian Studies. So we're delighted to welcome those three experts who will speak about the state and the future of Southeast Asian studies, China studies, Korea studies, respectively. And I will chime in with my views and observations on Japan studies, and we will have a discussion, and we'll open it up for questions and answers. So first, we'd like to start with about 10-minute
10 or 15.
reflection.
I think
you could speak up to 15.
I think I said 15.
We'll come down at 15 minutes. Yeah, all right. Don, take it away.
The reason 10 minutes versus 15 minutes matters is because there are two kinds of professors. There are those who know when to shut up and those who don't. And I'm in the second category. So in order to restrain my tendency to digress and talk on and on, I have actually done something perhaps a little bit unusual and rather formal. I have written my remarks. It's to save your time. Within our 7-year time frame from now to 2030, Southeast Asian studies will continue, albeit unevenly across diverse and divergent countries, to experience three trends: repatriation, hybridization, and, I hope, introspection. First, repatriation. Southeast Asian studies are modern in character and Western in origin. As an English language toponym, the name Southeast Asia lacked currency until 1943, 8 decades ago this August. In that year, the British American Southeast Asia Command was created to continue prosecuting World War II against Japan. As for Southeast Asian studies, they began mostly in philological scholarship undertaken at universities in European colonial metropoles, England, France, the Netherlands, and were developed further in the context of researching the natives who were being colonized, the better to rule them. One British colonial administrator, J.S. Furnivall, for example, became famous among 20th century Southeast Asianists for his conceptualization of economy-linked pluralism in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. A more personal example is the characterization of Burmese onlookers in Shooting an Elephant, George Orwell's ostensibly autobiographical narrative of fierce ambivalence toward his role as a British policeman in colonial Burma. The transformation of the region's colonies into independent states naturally fostered local intentions to reconsider and replace colonial perspectives with indigenous scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. Accordingly, Southeast Asian students competed for and earned higher degrees in Western universities, enabling subsequent careers of teaching and publication on Southeast Asian topics while living in the region, in the West, or elsewhere. For repatriation of the topic was not always accompanied by the physical return of the person, a Western-trained Southeast Asian scholar, to his or her own country. Looking forward to 2030, other things being equal, which of course they never are, the market inside Southeast Asia for experts on part or all of the region will be more robust and stable than the comparable Western demand for experts on Southeast Asia. That could be unintended good news for Southeast Asia, insofar as the last peak in American demand for such expertise occurred, I guess you could say unfortunately, during the Vietnam War. As ongoing centers of relevant scholarship based in Southeast Asia today, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam all come to mind, while Singapore will remain, in effect, Southeast Asia's Mecca for education and scholarship about the region, in my opinion. In striking contrast, the scholarly study of China in Southeast Asia, in Southeast Asian institutions in Southeast Asia, tends to favor Chinese history, Chinese culture, over foreign policy and state behavior, attributable perhaps in part due to the sensitivity of the latter topics due to tensions with Beijing. But compared to that, the study of Southeast Asia, as one might expect in Southeast Asia, is far more broader and does include political, economic, and other dimensions. Okay, that's repatriation. After repatriation, the second trend is hybridity. Sorry about the terminology. By which I mean the mixing of purely intellectual with practical policy rationales for studying Southeast Asia. The vaunted and reviled ivory tower, at the top of which scholars were pictured cogitating on abstractions with little or no reference to the lives of the uncredentialed masses far below, that tower no longer exists, if it ever did. Increasingly in Southeast Asia, urgent policy priorities are encouraging analysts to trade theorizing for pragmatism as a rationale for practice, for policy. The proliferation of the designation professors of practice in American academe is completely unnecessary in Southeast Asia, insofar as the desirable practicality of regional studies of Southeast Asia, is already taken for granted. Ex-World Bank Managing Director Mari Pangestu, for example, is now on the faculty of the University of Indonesia, where she has been studying economic development in Southeast Asia without any need to be named a professor of practice. That she has been a practitioner goes without saying. What does need saying is that future risks to Southeast Asians, triggered, for instance, by viral contagions, climate catastrophes, together with a range of less globally deadly challenges, will continue to reinforce the overlapping and the interaction of policy priorities with scholarly pursuits. Think tanks in Southeast Asia strive to play this intermediating role, symbolized by the invention of Track 2 dialogues meant to create middle ground, where government officials who normally talk policy among themselves securely on Track 1 can engage autonomous scholars used to exchanging hypotheses with each other in public fora on Track 3 in Track 2, in the middle, where they meet. But chatting on Track 2 is not necessarily successful, at least not always. A senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, based on his experience serving on the State Department's policy planning staff, once imagined a meeting between an academic thinker and a policy planner. He argued that for the policymaker, any outside idea, including whatever the scholarly thinker might have in mind, resembles, and I'm quoting, a diamond ring on a desert island, abstractly valuable, but practically useless. I love that quote. Rizal Sukma, a notably hybrid Track 2 scholar, think tanker, and former Indonesian ambassador to the United Kingdom, tweeted that quote that I just read in apparent agreement with its skeptical view. But the likelihood that more people saw Rizal's tweet than read the Brookings Fellows' original critique illustrates the far greater reach of hybridity, fueled by technology through social media, and thereby further falsifying the image of the cerebral scholar happily isolated, ruminating in an ivory tower while wearing and flashing that useless diamond ring, as if to confirm the joke about the professor who says, "Look, I know it works in practice, but does it work in theory?" Speaking of ideas, some years ago, a leading Southeast Asian think tanker publicly credited me with having first recommended that the different foreign policy think tanks spread throughout the region should join hands in an overarching institution. The ASEAN Institutes of Strategic and International Studies, or ASEAN-ISIS, does now exist, at least as a collection, although in all candor, the productivity of its members varies greatly. ASEAN-ISIS does sponsor a useful annual Track 2 style conference whose regional composition is well suited to discuss the future of ASEAN itself. In years to come, that topic will gain more and more salience as the debate about ASEAN and the very notion of regional solidarity that ASEAN was designed to foster unfolds, expands, and becomes, I predict, more intense. My third and last guess about the future tenor of Southeast Asian studies is introspection. ASEAN will continue to exist. Depending on the rate and nature of its economic growth, the stability and legitimacy of its members, and the rise or fall of environmental and geopolitical risks, both the region and ASEAN could flourish. But if I may quote the latest Freedom House designations, 6 of ASEAN's 10 member countries, a majority, are, quote, not free. Whatever that means exactly, it's basically authoritarian rule, right? Are not free. 4 are partly free, and not a single one is fully free. Now, that's Freedom House, partly funded through the National Endowment for Democracy, which has a kind of Track 1 cast to it. You can take the judgment or you can leave it. But it would appear to be the case that democracy is hard put to install itself long-term in Southeast Asia, at least given the situation that we face today with regard to those potentials for authoritarian rule. And not just potentials, if I may put in a footnote, right now in Bangkok, a situation that I don't particularly want to get into, it's highly complicated, could result in a coup. Yet another coup in a long list of coups in that particular country. That would certainly not help the spread of democracy in Southeast Asia. I'm not predicting that that will happen, incidentally. I'm not predicting it, but it could. In the meantime, in any case, ASEAN is in crisis. The brutal and bloody dictatorship in Myanmar, whose gruesome predation on its own people, ASEAN has failed to stop, is no longer allowed to attend ASEAN summits. At least they're no longer allowed to attend ASEAN summits in their official capacity, right? In that sense, one could say that this 10-member grouping really only has 9 members, insofar as Myanmar is outside the door, at least at the summit level. The dilemma that Burma's dictatorship for a regional organization committed to the principle of non-interference poses is how to live with a junta without being contaminated by it. Western analysts of Southeast Asia are paying attention, no question. But the ability of indigenous Southeast Asianists based in the region to deal with the charge that ASEAN has become a club of actual and would-be dictators will depend on the academic freedom of those scholars that either will enjoy or won't enjoy in years to come. To conclude, I am glad that Southeast Asian studies have been repatriated. I am hopeful that the hybridization of Southeast Asian studies by Southeast Asian scholars is enlarging their audience and maintaining the policy relevance of their ideas, even in the face of possibly unreceptive policy makers. But I am worried that anti-democratic trends in the region could constrict the ability of those scholars. Colleagues of mine, I mean, they are Southeast Asian, but we interact a lot. Many of them are here, some are there. Those colleagues and friends are trying to do the best that they can to maintain scholarly autonomy in a region where it is becoming little by little, marginally less and less possible to maintain that essential precondition for scholarship, which is academic freedom.
Mr. Gold?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to congratulate APARC on your 40th anniversary. I have to admit at being surprised at being invited to speak at this Stanford event, having spent the same 40 years across the bay at another institution. Surely you could have found someone else to reflect on this topic. No names, please. Although, of course, there is no rivalry between Stanford and Berkeley in any sphere of life. I must say I offer my congratulations with a certain degree of jealousy and envy at the current state of affairs as regards contemporary China studies at our 2 schools. I watched the video this morning getting increasingly heated about admiring what you're doing and worrying about the situation over there. But I digress. But my assignment is to look beyond these 2 places to the larger field of Chinese studies. And spoiler alert, I'm quite pessimistic, at least for the short to medium term. And this goes for almost all fields of scholarly inquiry, sociology in particular, at least as practiced by myself and my students, which is largely ethnographic. By way of personal experience, I started studying Chinese in the 1960s. At that time, it certainly seemed that there was no possibility to go to the real China to study language in situ or conduct any fieldwork. So like most people of my generation and before, I went to Taiwan for language work and to live in a Mandarin-speaking environment. In the 1960s and 70s, for scholars of contemporary Chinese society and politics, the main alternative to in-country data collection was the University Service Center in Hong Kong. This invaluable institution not only collected as much material, open and neibu, meaning for internal circulation, as it could from China, it also arranged interviews with people who had left the country for one reason or another. Given the paucity of data coming out of China, the idea of doing survey research or sophisticated data analysis was effectively impossible. My advisor, Ezra Vogel, and Andy Walder's advisor, Marty White, and our contemporaries, Andy, Walder, and Jean Oy among them, benefited enormously from the resources provided by the University Service Center. Although through most of that era, the China studies field was small, and in addition to the manifest research function, the center also fulfilled the latent function of providing a base to nurture a community of scholars, not only from the US, but from Europe and Japan as well. I personally ended up doing my dissertation about Taiwan, but soon after returning from fieldwork, I was selected for the first group of American exchange students to study in China and spent a year at Fudan University in Shanghai, 1979 to 1980. I had been warned that I would not be able to make real friends or visit Chinese in their homes and to be prepared for a year of loneliness. As it turned out, a lucky combination of the early days of reform, when nobody knew what the rules were, plus my contacts as an interpreter for Chinese delegations and through the Oberlin-Shanxi Memorial Association, gave me entree into a wide variety of homes and social gatherings. For the next 40 years, with some blips to be sure, the scope for research in China only expanded, including long-term residence in cities and villages, survey research, participant observation, and access to reams of data on all aspects of life. My main base, the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, changed dramatically in terms of its openness to foreign scholars and hosting international conferences. More people entered the field, including many Chinese who took foreign degrees, and the interaction between Chinese scholars and foreign scholars became increasingly regular and non-controversial and very beneficial. Chinese universities and think tanks hosted foreign scholars, and the same thing happened abroad. For historians, access to archives was unprecedented. My students all did extensive fieldwork in a variety of settings and in different locales. It really looked and in practice seemed to herald a new era. Scholars with no China background also started studying China. Of course, we know that the combination of the rise and consolidation of power by Xi Jinping, facilitated by COVID, has put a kibosh on basically all the things we started to take for granted as far as research and exchange went. American government policy has certainly not helped. And certainly in Washington and many other places, engagement, which many of us committed our careers to, is now a dirty word. The implications for research at present are pretty catastrophic. We're in many ways back to where we were in the 60s and 70s, when access to research in China was impossible. For established scholars, the situation is grim, but for graduate students and junior scholars, it is worse, and it will be necessary to come up with creative second best solutions for research. Unfortunately, the Hong Kong option is off the table, but substitutions can be found for at least some of its functions. For instance, there is now a large diaspora of Chinese from the PRC of all ages, as well as those who still come abroad for study, research, work, and settlement, who can be interviewed and surveyed if amenable. There are also WeChat, Weibo, and TikTok, as well as Chinese academic journals that provide a rich source of information on virtually any topic, not all of it reliable or valid to be sure. I've been talking about research access, which of course has a major impact on Chinese studies. But even more important is institutional commitment to Asian studies and area studies as a whole. The debate about disciplines versus area studies is unresolved, but seems to be increasingly tending towards denigrating area expertise. And without support from departments and schools as a whole, the picture is even more grim. This also goes for the federal government, which suspended the Fulbright program in China and curtailed funding for other programs. We must find ways to reverse these decisions. Now is exactly the time for more investment in China studies. So from the China studies perspective, we need to think creatively about substitute ways to study and engage with our subject, at least for the time being. So on that upbeat note, I'll stop here and I welcome more upbeat assessments and questions. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. I would also like to begin by congratulating 40th anniversary of APARC, and I'm delighted to be here with other distinguished speakers and also to be in a panel with esteemed scholars. When thinking about our panel, the future of Asian studies, I was thinking to myself, I'm a historian. I'm used to talking about the past, not the future. Historians hate to predict the future, and I guess that's one of the reasons why we work with old, boring documents. But let me try my best to talk about the future of Asian or Korean studies in particular. I think what I will say in my talk is not necessarily about the future, but more of a suggestion of how or what path the Korean studies should direct to. So in this conference, I think we're looking into the 2030s, and by 2030, 2/3 of the world's population will be in Asia. And Asia continues to be one of the most vibrant and dynamic regions in the world. The geopolitical significance is certainly undeniable, and I don't think I need to elaborate on the importance of Asia here, or Asian studies for that matter. And in the limited time given to me, I think I'll elaborate on the importance of enhancing diversity and inclusion in our field. I think in the next decade, this is the future of Korean or even Asian studies and what we should be focusing on. From the mid-20th century, Asian studies developed and expanded, and the Association of Asian Studies now has almost 10,000 members worldwide. Research, teaching, and also programs continue to grow and expand. And I think Asian Studies is one of the strongest programs in many universities, differently including GW, where I teach. But I think what is lacking as of now is diversity in the field. So throughout my talk, I think I will discuss the issue of diversity, but let me try to first provide an overview of the field and get into the points that I want to lay out. In the US, area studies was a post-World War II and the Cold War phenomenon, as we know, and this was to study about other parts of the world, particularly for national security concerns. And as the Cold War ended, there were brief moments when area studies was also thought to end, but that turned out to be incorrect. Area studies continues to thrive and very much alive in the US and elsewhere. Although area studies in the US initially developed for national security concerns, and also there were limitations of area studies such as research inquiries focusing around Orientalist view, modernization theory, and so on. But we do area studies today to critically understand the world we live in and to study different cultures, languages, governments, societies, etc. And we have to understand differences in order to live harmoniously and peacefully in this world. So the field of Asian studies continued to grow long after the Cold War. And Korean studies grew as part of Asian studies in the US from about 1940s and onwards. Until the 1990s, the US government funding sources, such as the Title VI grant and other private funding sources, were essential in building Asian studies. FLAS funded to study language, and back in the 1970s, Korean was treated as one of the lesser studied but strategic language, and also NRC, National Resource Center, supported programming of area studies. The Fulbright program was a significant source of support for research. And like other area studies, students and scholars benefited from these funding sources to study Korea. And from the 1990s, after South Korea achieved democracy, South Korean government began to fund Korean studies in North America and other parts of the world. And funding sources from South Korea, such as the Korea Foundation, modeled after the Japan Foundation, and also the Academy of Korean Studies, supported to conduct research, build programs, and create professorships outside of Korea. So it is after the Cold War when Korean studies actually expanded enormously in North America and the rest of the world. I'm not going to get into details of the history of Korean studies in North America or the state of the field, but I will briefly mention the following. Scholars who studied Korea between 1940s and 70s are regarded as the first generation of Korean studies scholars. And these scholars began to train students, and those who began to study in the 1970s mostly entered the field back then through the Peace Corps. And this generation, Peace Corps generation, they are regarded as the second generation of Korean studies scholars, and they played a critical role by beginning, and they began to expand the field by building programs, publishing research, and training PhD students who became then the next generation of Korean studies scholars. And the field expanded from, initially it was limited to small disciplines in history and social, in the humanities and social sciences. It expanded to a variety of disciplines, including history, literature, linguistics, anthropology, sociology, political science, and so on. So until the second generation, the field was mostly dominated by white male scholars. And from the third generation, it then expanded to Korean American and Koreans who came to study in the US. And basically, these were heritage students. As compared to earlier period, increase in heritage students has been one of the major demographic shifts in the composition of scholars working on Korea today. And for the future of Korean studies and Asian studies, for that matter, I would like to argue that we need to see more changes in this demographic composition in the field in the future. And I think focusing on diversity should be the key in the next decade or so to produce more dynamic and exciting field. In talking about diversity and inclusion, I would like to address 3 points. First, terminology and research collaboration issue. Second, language education. And third, diversifying the student body. Now first, Korean studies scholars often ask, what is Korean studies? And how should we situate or understand Korea within East Asia, Asia, or more broadly in the world? And of course, there is not a single definition of what Korean studies is. Korea is not a fixed concept by any means. The field has been continuously growing. It's not something we can easily define. Defining what it is may even be meaningless as the field continuously grow and change. As the field is evolving and changing, one thing is clear, that the field should be more inclusive. And like any other area of studies, it should not be an isolated field, and Korea should be studied vis-a-vis other countries. And Korean studies in the US, or Korean studies in South Korea, Korean studies in Europe evolved very differently. And it has its own different history. And what we mean by Korean studies in the US does not translate elsewhere. So let me give one example. In North America, when we use the term Korean studies, it includes the humanities and the social sciences that focus on studying about Korea. And this Korea includes early Korea covering the ancient period until 1945 and the contemporary two Koreas, including South and North Korea. And in Korean studies is called 한국학. And literally, a literal translation would be South Korean studies. And then they also use the term 북한학, which is literally North Korean studies. So some scholars of North Korea here in the US raise this issue about the word 한국학, which is South Korean studies. That's the term used in Korea, in South Korea, because the word is limited to the South, and they're somewhat uncomfortable with using 북한학 because it does not appropriately represent their research, because it's not just about North Korea post-1945. So their research is not isolated from broader Korean studies. And they also try to avoid using even the word North Korean studies. And so the term 한국학 in Korean is somewhat seems to be exclusive in some sense. So in English, it is not a problem because Korean studies is more comprehensive term. But due to the reality of divided Korea, the terms used in Korean are somewhat limited and becomes a problem for scholars outside of Korea. So with the growth of scholarship on North Korea in North America, I think it's worth considering how are we using terms Korean studies and 한국학, and what's lost in translation? How can we bridge the gap between insider in Korea, in South Korea, and outsider who are studying Korean studies outside of Korea? So we often discuss global Korean studies, but I think it is still pretty much regional-based, meaning scholars interact with their region, and it is still very challenging for scholars of different regions to get together to share research and teaching or discuss Korean studies in general. Although there is relatively more interaction among scholars in North America, Europe, and East Asia, we hardly have any interaction with scholars in other parts of the world. So last summer, I attended the Korea Foundation's 30th anniversary celebration of the Global Korean Studies Forum. And it was so interesting to see how Korean studies have been developed in Latin America, Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa, even Africa. And in order to diversify the field, I think it is important to expand a global network and learn from each other. And so for instance, some European countries such as Germany have a Korean Studies department and has much more intensive Korean Studies program than we do here in the US. And we often think US is leading Korean Studies outside of Korea, but that is not necessarily the case. And the student body in Europe and Asia is much bigger than what we have here in North America. And I think it is important to remain open and learn from each other to further develop Korean studies. Now, let me also briefly talk about language education. And I think language is the key to producing high quality research and is required to have certain level of language training to do area studies. And although a Korean language program has continuously developed past several decades, studying Korean language at an academic level is still a very challenging issue. Compared to Chinese or Japanese, there's less infrastructure to train high-level Korean to students in our institutions. So thanks to Hallyu or Korean Wave, that many high school students are nowadays studying Korean independently before college. And these are mostly non-heritage Korean students, non-heritage students. But to make these students reach the advanced level to conduct research on Korea needs extra effort and support and time. And ironically, students are increasing, but there are not enough Korean classes offered in North America. According to recent MLA survey, Korean language is the only language that is increasing, and yet we don't have enough advanced Korean classes to satisfy students. So in order to develop the field, I think it is important to build more infrastructure in teaching Korean language, and especially at advanced level. And language is always a barrier for many students to pursue at PhD level. And so I think it is very important to start investing early on, especially starting at the undergraduate level. And if there are students who are showing potential, I think we should encourage them to study the language at the next level by sending them to Korea to learn the language and also help them read primary and secondary sources in Korean, which is often hard to get through the classes that we teach Korean. And then I would like to move on to diversifying student body in Korean studies. In order to enhance Korean studies to the next level, I think it is critical to strengthen diversity and inclusion in the field of Korean studies. And this enhancing diversity through students and scholars from different races, ethnicities, and social backgrounds is extremely crucial in strengthening the field by asking different questions and bringing diverse perspectives. And to deepen the reach of Korean studies, we must cultivate the next generation of Korean studies experts to enhance diversity. And I would like to briefly share GW's example of enhancing diversity and inclusion. GW was awarded with a Title VI grant, both FLATS and NRC. And so with the Institute for Korean Studies and East Asia National Resource Center, we have developed a cornerstone partnership with Spelman College, which is a historically Black liberal arts college for women in Atlanta, Georgia. Spelman College has a robust Asian studies program with minors in Asian studies, Chinese studies, and Japanese studies, but they lack Korean studies. And so despite its strong foundation in Asian studies, they do not have enough Korean classes offered. And so we try to offer resources that we have in Korean studies at GW with our partnering institution at Spelman College, and allow Spelman students to participate in our undergraduate research fellows program, summer program, and so forth. And also we invite Spelman students to GW and participate in professional development program in East Asian studies. So diversifying the field to include minority students in the next 10 years, I think is crucial in developing the field further. As the field expanded by having more Korean heritage students in the 90s and 2000s, I think the fourth generation of Korean studies scholars should consist of more diverse demographics. And diversifying scholars in the field will lead to the production of new and meaningful scholarship in the future. To conclude, I would like to just mention that studying Korea, Korean studies is not a fixed concept, and it continues to be defined, redefined, and negotiated. And when conducting Korea as a site of research, it means various things, and the field should be more inclusive than exclusive. And so by what I mean by this, I would like to just give you an example that for example, there's this scholar, Crystal Anderson, who recently published a book, Soul in Seoul, Black Popular Music and K-pop, published by University of Mississippi Press in 2020. She is a scholar of African and African American studies, focusing on Black internationalism and global Asias. And she does not consider herself as Korean studies scholar, but I think it is very important. But there are many scholars like her in the field of, let's say, English literature or Latin American history, who are expanding their area of research in looking at Korea. And so I think it is important to find scholars like her in other fields to expand network and to work on more collaborative research to produce diverse scholarship. And so I guess I made myself clear in trying to convey the point that diversifying the content and personnel for the future of Korean studies would be important. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So I'll share my views very briefly on Japan studies, and it's interesting to hear from experts from of different regions. So it sounds like Korea studies has been a very successful case, especially in the post-Cold War environment, where a lot of area studies have been having a hard time. China studies, from the point of view of Japan studies person, have been very successful because of the growth of China. Correspondingly, attention to China studies, students studying China, scholars and resources have grown, but it's understandable that you are somewhat pessimistic now looking at the challenges in the bilateral relationship that makes China studies, field work and other things difficult. Southeast Asian studies, Don was measured in whether he's optimistic or pessimistic, but I think there's a lot to be optimistic about, given the growth of Southeast Asia as a region. Japan studies, there was a lot of pessimism in the Japan studies community. There still is. So in the 1980s, Japan was what is China today. So a lot of people were interested in Japan, studied Japan. There were a lot of Japanese students coming to study here, a lot of scholarly exchanges. Much of that, I wouldn't say all of that, much of that has declined quite a bit as Japan as an economic superpower declined. And interest in Japan, you can interpret it in different ways. Japan is no longer a threat. A lot of Americans in hindsight wonder why they were so worried about Japan in the 80s. Japan was never a security threat. It's under US's nuclear umbrella. It was an economic power, but in hindsight, there was not that much to worry about compared to what Americans are worried about China today. But that was the reason why Japan had a lot of attention at the time in the 80s. Fast forward to today, Japan is very few people see Japan as an economic threat anymore. It is an important ally as the US-Japan competition intensifies. So I think in the past 5 years or so, there's a renewed interest in Japan's political economy, especially security dimensions. But overall, if you look at the past really 40 years, if you look at the origin of APARC, Japan studies was front and central with all due respect to China studies. So that has declined quite a bit. And you see that in, for instance, PhD students interested in Japan, especially in political science, economics, sociology, in social science disciplines. Okay? I mean, on the other hand, there's a lot of interest in Japan's popular culture, anime, manga. Those things become a gateway to Japan studies. So I think in history and literature, in those areas, and the number of students studying Japanese language, those areas seem to be doing okay. But somebody like me who studies politics and economics and society of Japan from social science perspectives, it's hard to see Japan as a vibrant field in that area, although we're trying to revive that. Okay? And I often talk about how that is also related to the decline of area studies as a whole. So I want to talk a little bit about that with all of you. And Korea studies, again, it may be an exception. In the post-Cold War world, really the funding has declined for area studies, especially social science studies of certain Asian countries, Japan being a prominent example. And I noticed that, I don't want to name this university, but there's this university who's been searching for Japan political scientists for years and having a hard time filling the position because it's hard to find somebody who has area studies knowledge, but at the same time satisfies the departmental criteria for disciplines like political science. Because political science, economics, sociology, they become much more focused on theory, general theory development or universal model building, okay? And specific knowledge about certain country, certain society is not as valued anymore. So with that in mind, I think FSI is kind of a unique institution. It's within a university setting, right? And it has an appointing capacity. So we actually can house a lot of area knowledge within the context of a top-rated university like Stanford. But a lot of other places are having a hard time because departmental needs conflict with the need for area knowledge. So how do you see the future in terms of future of Asian studies in the university setting? Because a lot of talented young PhDs are now going to think tanks. And there's nothing wrong with it. But as a university person, I worry that we might be losing area knowledge on university campuses when a lot of students are still interested in learning about Asia and other areas, different parts of the world. But we have less to offer in that context. So can you talk a little bit about that? This relates to Don's hybridity issue as well. But can you say a little bit about the future of Asian studies in the university setting specifically? Whoever, maybe starting with Don.
Well, at least with regard to Southeast Asia, it's clear to me that the driver of employment is the discipline. It's not the area. And so area expertise is a plus. It's an add-on. But the real question is, if you want a tenure track position in the United States, it's the discipline that matters. And of course, the discipline comes with all manner, not only of methodologies, but also of theoretical debates, some of them quite abstract, which can then even further diminish the ability to address in more straightforward terms, almost even perhaps journalistic terms, I don't know. We haven't talked about journalism, but it's important to include that on the map. That it's really it's the discipline that really matters. And in a way, that could be said to be unfortunate, but on the other hand, if you have Southeast Asia represented in connection with various disciplines, as sometimes is the case in larger universities, then you can get together and cross-disciplinary activity can take place, and the notion of an area as distinctive can be preserved. So I'm not all that pessimistic, but the dominance of the disciplines and the dominance particularly of quantitative methodology is clear.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I said the way that the time and the way that I was trained, there was no real need for the kind of sophisticated methodology that now dominates.
Yeah.
Because to study China, there was nothing to work with, or you could try to come up with some data. But it was really very, very unreliable. When I was hired at Berkeley in 1981, it was a China slot. I was hired to do China. And when I retired in 2018, the department had a search, but not for a China person. There was just, they were blessed with the ability to search for a new assistant professor. And we ended up hiring your student, who is Chinese and who studies China. But she was not hired as a China person, but she's teaching China. So I'm very pleased to see that at least that's carrying on in the sociology department at Berkeley. I think the interest in Asian studies at Berkeley continues to be very strong. But I think in terms of so many retirements and our financial situation, it's very difficult to lobby for for area studies positions, especially in social science. Our political science department is, I think, facing a real crisis now. Now, in the Korean area, for years, that we have been searching for a Korean historian and never hired anybody. And I think that's because of department politics more than qualified candidates. And what else is going to say about Korea? I agree with all the points that you were making about Korea. But in terms of mentioning journalists, I'm reading Mike Chenoy's book called Assignment China, which is about journalists. And you could substitute social scientists for journalists in almost all of the things that he's talking about in terms of coming in and how do you try to learn something about China when you can't go to China? And then when you can go to China, the rules are so obscure and so vague, you just keep constantly testing limits. And then it looked like, wow, we can do just about anything. And suddenly, bang, the lid comes down again. And so now the situation for journalists, American journalists and other foreign journalists in China right now is really quite desperate. So I think that's an interesting, also an interesting characteristic, a way of looking at that.
Yeah, if I may add, I totally agree that discipline plays a key role in terms of finding tenure-track jobs. I think this discipline precedes, I think, so when one is to identify one's scholarship or as a scholar, I think defining oneself from the based on discipline is more important than getting a job. More important in getting a job than defining one as an area studies scholar. So for example, nowadays, in recent years, when there are positions opened in Korean studies, it's very broadly defined. Like, Korean culture studies, whatever that may be. It could be anything. Or sometimes I even see Korean studies position. So it's very open-ended, and yet what they're looking for internally may be very specific. So for example, in some institutions, they open positions such as Korean culture, and yet I know that what they're looking for is media person who can teach Korean film and culture because that's the students' demand. And so, but at the same time, they want somebody to also they want somebody who could also teach Korean literature. So when it comes to Korean studies position, they expect this Koreanist, this expert, this scholar to be able to teach broadly as possible because there aren't that many Koreanists in one department. And so when hiring somebody, they expect this person to be expert on so many things, especially when it comes to teaching. So again, I think discipline comes first, then when it comes to tenure-track jobs. And I think you can't really although area studies have been continuously emphasized, I think this is still the case and it's the reality.
Thank you. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So if you have any questions, please line up behind that microphone to start asking questions. John, if you... Please, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you for this talk, everyone. I have a comment sort of question mainly to Dr. Kim, but everybody also I would like to answer. Tabitha, I'm a master's student in the International Policy program here, and I have a China focus. And most relevantly, I'm also on the leadership board of the National Association for Black Engagement with Asia. One of our members is Crystal, who published that book, so I was like, hey. So I was really happy you brought up the point of diversity, and I wanted to make the comment that, at least for a lot of Black students who are interested in Asia studies and also Hispanic students, a big barrier to getting into the field is the racism's an issue globally, but especially in homogenous societies, it's very, very acute. And I've had really bad experiences, in Asia too. And so I know that's a huge barrier for people, including the financial and everything. But then there's also that there's questions you'll get from family who are why are you going there when they hate, your people and are going to be really, So I guess, is this something that has been discussed, talked about for particularly targeting and motivating diverse students from underrepresented backgrounds to get in your respective fields, or just your thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, it is very challenging, especially in places like Korea, where it used to be relatively more homogeneous because there were less non-Koreans living in Korea. But I think now recently the trend has been changing because there are there are just so many immigrants living in Korea, and also with South Korea being more globalized, I think the people's perception has been changing as well, and also due to the lowest birth rate in South Korea today, there is definitely discussion of trying to accept more immigrants in South Korea. Although there is a lot of debate to that as well, but I think, and so although it won't change overnight, but gradually I think it has changed, and I think it is definitely changing. And I think also different people have different experiences. So for example, African Americans have different experiences in Korea compared to Africans who come to Korea. So depending on where you're from, there's also that difference. But differently, I think for now, South Korea itself as a society is changing, but I think also when going to South Korea and also having the language, being able to know the culture and speak the language, and I think that also can be very helpful before going to Korea and try to understand, what to expect when being there. And just one more thing, and I think there are a lot of also celebrities nowadays in South Korea, foreign celebrities, and that's been also impacting a lot in terms of the perception of South Koreans toward foreigners. So hopefully I think it will change more to a heterogeneous society in the future. And I think it is an ongoing.
My name is Michael Sun. I run a venture capital firm, but also I donate to Stanford. I'm just curious whether you have any predictions for the G7 summit in Hiroshima, whether the world leaders might go to Itoshima Shrine or the Hiroshima Peace Park. Maybe there might be some breakthroughs or developments. Of course, we'll wait for the communique, but just curious.
Well, I guess I'm a Japan person. I don't know if there's going to be any breakthroughs. It's good that President Biden is going. He almost had to cancel, right? But he had to cancel the later trip to Papua New Guinea and Australia, but he's going there. Prime Minister Kishida is focused. He's from Hiroshima. His focus is on nuclear disarmament. So there'll probably be some kind of statements on that. But is it going to be a breakthrough? I doubt it. There might be something more interesting around AI. There might be some kind of agreements on AI that might be, or some kind of guidelines around AI policies that might be issued. But in terms of real breakthroughs, I don't know if we could expect that. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking up about area studies. By way of spoiler, I'll introduce myself. I'm Lalita Duperon. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for South Asia at Stanford. And I'm curious why you think that, while APARC very commendably has a South Asia initiative, but nevertheless, I'm curious why you think neither the future nor indeed the present of Asian studies appears to include South Asia. Thank you.
That's an excellent point. It's interesting that we have Southeast Asia program, Japan program, Korea program, China program, and health program. We have South Asia initiative, but not yet a program. I mean, Guido can speak more authoritatively about that and its history, but we certainly aspire to. Definitely, we would want to do that, to have a South Asia program. I can't speak for the director, but
I don't just mean at Stanford, obviously, thank you, I appreciate that, and we love the South Asia Initiative at APARC, but just the field, I mean, the Association of Asian Studies desperately tried to recruit more South Asianists to the conference, to the field, and just really wasn't able to, and it really seen as two distinct fields, and I don't know whether you can comment on how that came to be and what we can do to counteract it, because it is Asia.
absolutely. Thank you for that.
I'll sit down, but thank you.
Well, I mean, where angels fear to tread, right, fools rush in, so I'm the fool. It's possible that Southeast Asian studies has a more firm identity in academe compared to South Asia because of ASEAN. And the equivalent in South Asia, there is an equivalent, but candidly, some months ago, we had a delegation from New Delhi come through, and I asked them, about the region and how important it is and so forth. And not that this is typical of opinions on the part of Indian scholars, but his answer was quite deprecatory. He said, no, that's the region. No, what really matters is India, and we've got a problem with China, and we've got a problem with Pakistan. So it's a kind of a three-way focus. Now, again, I'm not sure how general that opinion is, but to the extent that that is the view of the people in New Delhi who could take the initiative in cooperation with people here in the US and in Europe and so forth to generate a real sense of South Asia as a studyable region, that may be a small answer as to why there really isn't a Southeast Asia emphasis in American academia, at least.
It's strange to hear the question put that way round. In the UK, we have exactly the opposite problem. We're knee-deep in studies on South Asia. But the question I wanted to put to you all was, you're talking about the future of Asian studies, and listening to you talk, it seems that what you mean is the future of Asian studies in the United States. Now, over the last 30 years, I think one of the big changes has been that in the free Asian societies, South Korea, Japan, a lot of the Southeast Asians, only partly free, but nevertheless, there's been this tremendous efflorescence of studies of their countries by their own academics. Right. I mean, Japan in particular has produced an extraordinary array of studies of all aspects of Japanese society, the economy, and so on and so forth. As this grows, how much of a role do you think will remain for outsiders still studying these countries? It's looking to me like a lot of the ground has already been domesticated. Thanks.
I was going to remark on South Asian studies in the UK might be stronger because of imperialism, but I was worried that was an offensive remark, so thank you for... but I tried to allude to the fact that there has been big growth, certainly in the China field, of scholars from China who are studying abroad, and then the field is being increasingly, I don't know, taken over doesn't sound good, but I mean, dominated or populated by people from China. So, for instance, the person who's doing China in our department right now is from China, that did her PhD work in the United States. And many of them have gone back to China as well. And I'm not sure what the situation politically is now going to be with those Chinese who've studied social science or whatever in the United States or in the West going back, what sort of issues they might face as being suspect. But I think that's definitely a trend that people from the region are taking over and taking the lead. And I also wanted to, something else I was thinking of is in terms of the growth of Asian studies or East Asian studies is the rise of Taiwan studies. That partly this is the PRC's fault or contribution, is that as China has become harder to do research, Taiwan they've had some very creative people who've stepped in and funded Taiwan studies. And among the most active places for Taiwan studies are the UK and Germany, right? So it's not, the US, it's growing and more schools are getting money to start Taiwan studies programs. And it's just, they make a clear point that's distinct from China studies. So that's another consequence of what China's been doing to itself and its position in the world.
And I would simply say, don't misinterpret the panel. Asian studies are alive and well and living in Asia, period. I mean, the United States comes in partly for economic reasons. We're a wealthy country. Partly for intellectual reasons, which we haven't talked about at all, because that would be a very different conversation, namely, the ivory tower. The theorizing that goes on at American universities, including on Southeast Asia, is absolutely massive. And so it's understandable that scholars in Southeast Asia want to, get aboard. That's the issue. Are you a realist or are you a constructivist? Now, this is an abstract conversation that doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with policy in Southeast Asia, with reality in Southeast Asia, but nevertheless, it's really fun and fascinating. And not only that, but scholars who are at universities in Southeast Asia and who want to get tenure at those universities can increase their chances radically by publishing in American scholarly journals, in European scholarly journals. Now, that sounds neo-colonial, but I'm just saying it's a fact, right? And so, obviously, there will be a role for Southeast Asianists all around the world, but there is clearly a massive role for them, and they're doing their best in Southeast Asia. I think we really need to credit that. I don't want to leave you with a misinterpretation.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I was talking about what we do, how we do Korean studies or Asian studies for that matter in North America is different from doing Korean studies in, let's say, Korea or Europe or elsewhere. So, of course, Korean studies in Korea, it has its own, it is vibrant on its own, and a lot of scholarship is being produced. But when it comes to English written scholarships in about Korean studies, I think, inevitably, because major publications are published here, I think, it is inevitable without talking about what's being produced here in terms of what's out there in Korean studies. But I think one thing, in my graduate years, my advisors and scholars have been talking about bridging the gap between Korean studies in Korea and here in the U.S. And yet still, I see that that bridge has not been. I think there's still challenges. So because research collaboration is always emphasized, but it's not as easy as it seems due to the way how research is done differently in Korea or in Asia versus here in the U.S. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be collaborating. And I think language is the main issue, because then when we are working together, we have to, there has to be translation issue. And so there's twice as much as work, or even more than that. And so I think and then also methodologically and also in terms of what's been emphasized, there are differences. And so researchers have been trying to bridge the gap, and yet I must admit it still is a challenging thing to kind of overcome that issue.
Great. We'll take one last question from.
Thank you. First of all, I'm really impressed by the discussion here, and we realized where the problem is. And I see nowadays in Asian studies here, I see three kind of scholars. First, real area specialists focusing on very deep and and the second type is the theory-oriented, more I think the discipline-oriented. And third is a kind of a policy-oriented people. And if you look at the TVs and so on, the Washington people really debating, kind of a strategist. And I think in Japan, I think area specialists used to be very powerful and very much lacking theory-oriented type. But nowadays, I think the situation is kind of quite similar because policy-oriented think tankers, those people are really widening. So in that sense, I think so what the solution is, it's very difficult to kind of to bridge all kinds of these the areas. And in the future Asian studies, so of course Stanford may help or may assist. The provost said that policy oriented and also academics you have to bridge like this. So what's kind of future the Asian studies, particularly area specialists, is going to be. So that's for the American policy, probably more policy-oriented people. I think more you need the kind of, you have to know about what's happening in the real Asia, right? So in that sense, area specialists are more important, right? So what is any solution for this? It's a really I feel it's a great issue, right? So that's my
solution.
Solution you have?
We don't need a solution. It's not a problem. I mean, think of the things we have not talked about. We have not talked about the history of Asia in detail. We have not talked about Asian literature. Poetry, music, I could go on and on. Language, right? And all of those topics are covered by academics who, frankly, to be honest, probably don't care about policy. And in fact, to be, frank about it, it's probably good that they don't care about policy because then they might do less interesting work on classical area studies, in the sense of delving deeper into a society, a culture, the psychology of the people, and so forth, right? So I think remember that there is this massive thing called Asian studies that I've just tried to convey that is being completely ignored in our conversation. And so, there's no problem. It's alive. It could be better, obviously. I mean, I'm not saying that it's perfect, but there are people that are doing that, and God bless them.
So I think we have to close, but I would say that, so humanities, Asian studies in humanities, as Don said, doing great, doing fine. As somebody who cares about area studies, Asian studies in social sciences, I still think that there needs to be some kind of, if not solution, remedies. And what we discussed about repatriation kind of issues, Korean studies in Korea, Japan studies in Japan, all that knowledge, the way for that to come to the United States or Europe and to spread throughout the world, as Professor Kim alluded to, is to write in English. And for that, coming to places like Stanford and getting a degree here, that would be a very significant boost for that knowledge to spread throughout the world. For that, I think one solution might be that FSI starts issuing PhDs. That might be a way to solve a lot. Yeah. So
Really?
With that, I'm afraid I have to have the last word, and please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.